Hi everybody and welcome back. This is our last edition of our study for the month of June of Creation Stories. Next month, throughout the entire month of July, we will be looking at migrant stories. We'll start at least within the book of Genesis and look at some of the stories of migration and how that plays an important part in the telling of the story in the Old Testament. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to skip some of our preliminary information. Contact us if you have any questions. I'm going to throw a whole lot of information at you. There'll be some scriptural verses up here. You can take a picture of the video if you would like to see that, but I'll try to reprint them on our handouts. But they will not be available till at least tomorrow, because I have a very busy day today. I've already had several meetings and I'm trying to get this up and running before it gets too late. So we are looking at the flood story in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, okay? And that's a lot of material to cover, and there are a lot of really interesting intricacies within that story that we're trying to cover as well. And so I don't want you to miss some of the details. So first we'll just start with a general overview of the story, and I want to present it in a way that perhaps you haven't heard it before. And I'm seeing within this story something of what we call a chiasm. Chi is the letter X in Greek. A chiasm is something that goes in one direction and then comes back, almost like the side of an X. I've tried to illustrate it with the way I have this written out here. The story begins with the fact that creation is good and bad, mostly bad. There's an odd story in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 6. I'm going to let you read that on your own, but I am going to tell you it's odd, and it seems to be written from a worldview that is completely alien to us, alien to much of the rest of the scriptures. Honestly, anybody who thinks they really understand Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 6, I think is not being completely honest with us. It's very odd. But it has to do with the sons of God. Not sure what that means. Not a big reference prior to this story or after. The sons of God looking at the daughters of men, finding them beautiful and cohabitating with them, and producing a race of the Nephilim, who are the warriors of old. Now there's an odd moment in that odd description that says who are and still are and continue to be the warriors of old. It's I don't know who wrote this. I don't know what it's doing there. I don't know how it helps, but it does seem to be at least one way of trying to describe how the world, which was created good in Genesis chapter 1, which was created a paradise of Eden in chapter 2, and then the expulsion from Eden in chapter 3. And now it looks like the entire world is just thoroughly corrupt. And those first 6 verses might be a way of describing how corrupt it has become, because it's not only the humans, but it's also the sons of God. Again, not sure what that reference is all about. But after that first curious story, then there's a reference that there's just violence all over the earth. And so much so that it needs cleansing, it needs purging. But within all of that, also in the 6th chapter, is a description of Noah as a good and righteous person. Noah. So you do have good and bad among the human species, the bad clearly outweighing the good, which is why only 8 people are going to be surviving by the end of the story. The second thing that happens is we get a glimpse into God's regret it's not so much anger, I think, as regret. God is sorry that God created humans. And that's unusual language about God. But if you look in chapter 6, verse 6, precisely, that's what it says. God is sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved God to the heart. So you've got God's pain and a very anthropomorphic way of speaking about God. Many modern Christians don't even like to think about God being sorry for something, because that seems to mitigate against God's omniscience all along. But that's how the story describes it. And then, after that, you've got the heart of the story, which is God telling Noah to build an ark, tells him precisely how to build it. Noah builds it. Noah and his 3 sons and their spouses, the women are never named, are the 8 humans on the ark, and then they also shepherd animals onto the ark. God shuts the door, the rains fall, the waters rise, the waters subside, finally the ark is opened, and they get out. So this middle part, I mean, this is the juice of the story. This is the part we all learned as children, and it's the part where we cross-stitch little throw pillows and things like that with pictures of giraffes and monkeys and gorillas on the ark. It's fun, but I'm calling it All Creatures Die / Are Preserved. Because when we focus on the ark, we're reading this as a salvation story. But if you take your focus off the ark and everything else that's happening, it's a very harsh story of God flooding the earth and taking life. So while children learn to love this story when they're little, perhaps through coloring books or illustrated Bibles or Sunday school material, there's usually an age at which suddenly it kicks in and a child might say, wait a minute, this is a terrible story. It's a tragic story. So it really does matter where you put your focus in this story. Are you looking at the ark? If so, this is a story of salvation. Are you not looking at the ark? If so, this is a story that depicts God in the worst manner possible. And it's a story that's hard for us to reckon with. Is God like this? Could God possibly be like this? And I will tell you, biblical writers after this story continue to struggle with that. Is this really how God is? We'll talk about that either in this video or on Wednesday or this weekend during worship. Now, after the flood is over and Noah and them come out, we once again have a moment where God is sorry. It's not the precise language that's used there, but when Noah comes out, he sacrifices some of the animals. That's a bit of a curious thing. And chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, God said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So this isn't perhaps God saying, I am sorry, but it is God changing God's course, that from this moment forward, I will never do this again. So in some sense, God is back to the regret that we saw that God regretted having created humans in the first place. And then after the flood is over, there's a description in chapter 7, when God says God will never once again destroy the earth. I left out a little phrase, because in the middle of that, God says, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. So the flood did not take away all the evil in the world. It didn't cleanse the world. It didn't kill all the bad people to where only good people are left. And the situation of God, in God's righteousness perhaps, vis-a-vis humans in their corruption and sinfulness and violence and so forth, really hasn't changed as a result of the flood. After the flood, we still have humans with evil inclinations in their hearts. So I mean, a great question to wrestle with as we go along is just, why? Why did this whole thing happen? Why did we start all over again just to start all over again? Unless somehow we took away that evil inclination, and we did not, according to the end of the story. So that's why I'm saying there's a chiastic structure here. It begins and ends kind of the same way. Along the way, God regrets, and God regrets, and in the middle you have this catastrophic story of either death or salvation. That's an overview of the story. We're not going to be able to read it all because it's incredibly long. But what I want to do is approach this story as a literary story, okay? As we approach literature, and in doing so, I'm going to look at three things. We're going to start with what's called doublets. Doublets. A doublet is when a comment or an observation is made twice. And frankly, there's no reason for the second time, unless it's the purpose of the narrator perhaps to emphasize something. Then you might say it more than once. But in terms of just informing the reader, you don't need it more than once. So doublets are important. They show something at work in the writing of a story. And so we're going to wrestle a little bit with what the doublets represent. But let's observe them first. In the 6th chapter, in verse 5, as well as in verses 11 through 13, we hear that humans are the cause of God's flood being unleashed. What's interesting to me, and I don't want you to miss this, we won't have a lot of time to mess with this right now, is nothing about human evil points back to chapter 3, the story of the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve disobey and are kicked out of Eden, which Christian theologians and many Jewish theologians have made the source of the origin of sin, right? Nothing in this story points to chapter 3 as the origin of sin. If anything, it points to Genesis chapter 4, which records the first murder of Cain murdering Abel. And shortly after that, the second murder, which was an imitation of Cain and Abel. In many ways, it would seem that writers of this story feel like if you want to talk about original sin or the origin of sin, you look at chapter 4 when it's violence. So, on the one hand, in verse 5, humans are named as the cause of evil, and partly because of this cohabitation between the sons of men and the daughters of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Later, it's specifically said because of the violence that humans have on the earth. So the cause is repeated. Secondly, Noah is warned about the flood on two different occasions. First in chapter 16 when he's told to build the ark, and then in chapter 7 when he's told to get into the ark. And so it's kind of interesting that that's repeated. It may not be a big deal, might be a big deal. The third thing is the command about gathering animals is repeated. Here's one, we're going to circle back to this in a couple of slides because it's kind of key and very important. But it's both in the 6th chapter that Noah is told to go and gather all the animals, and it's in the 7th chapter that Noah is told to go and gather animals. And the second time, it's not like, hey, remember you're supposed to do this, or look, it's about time you got started, you're running out of time. It's not that. it appears like an original command in the 7th chapter. So it's a doublet. What happened in chapter 6 is something that happened in chapter 7, almost as if it hadn't already happened. There are 2 different verses that say specifically that Noah and his family entered into the ark. The second is a little more descriptive because it names all of his sons and mentions their spouses. The first time it's mentioned in chapter 7, verse 7, it says that they went in 7 days before it began to rain. The second time that is mentioned, it says that the rain started and on that day they entered the ark. So not only do we have a doublet here, but now we're starting to see that sometimes when something is repeated, it doesn't always square up. We'll look at some of those. I consider this a minor one, but I did want you to see that. Look at those verses and just see that they don't quite sync with one another. So there's more to it than just the repetition, not just a doublet, but a bit of a tension. There's also, on 2 successive verses, chapter 7, verses 10 and 11, each time it says that the flood began. The second time is a little more detailed, just like it was when it talked about the families entering the ark. Another doublet is in the verses in chapter 7, 21 through 23. You could almost call this a triplet, because I want you to hear this. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Then it says, everything on the dry land in whose nostril was the breath of life died. And then it says, only Noah was left, and those who were with him on the ark. So you don't have to keep going on and on. Once you say that all flesh died that moved on the earth and all humans, you pretty well covered it. You don't have to circle back and say everything died. I seriously mean it. Everything died, right? So when you get a doublet like that, the emphasis, it could be simply to make it a stronger emphasis for sure, or it could be other things. All right, the 7th doublet that we see is when the flood ends. And this one may not be quite as convincing as the others, but notice the language in the 2nd verse of chapter 8. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed. And then it goes on to say, the rains from the heaven were restrained. Now, I don't know very well what the language of the windows of the heavens is about. I imagine it means that just rain falls out of the heavens. That seems to be how it's been used earlier in this story. But those are 2 different ways of referring to the flooding. One has it coming as the rains, and the other has it coming as both the windows of heaven being open and the fountain from the deep coming up out of the earth itself, the waters coming out of the earth. But it's repeated, and it's repeated differently. So it's another doublet, as it were, but again, I don't know quite what to make of that, but I have some suggestions. And then, probably the strongest, most curious doublet to me is how God responds after the event. At the end of chapter 8, God promises never again to flood the earth. And I read these verses for you a moment ago, for as long as there will be springtime and harvest and so forth. It's very poetic. And in fact, if you read these verses 8, 20 through 22 out of your Bible, it's probably written in poetic form rather than prose. It's probably in a column, centered or something like that. It looks like lyrics to a song or something. Then in chapter 9, God responds again, only this time it's different. There's no prose there, but God makes a covenant with Noah. It's called the Noahic covenant. God makes a covenant with Noah never to flood the earth again. God is making a word. God has changed God's method, and God's not going to change from having changed God's method. And the sign is a rainbow. That's mentioned a couple of times. That doesn't happen in chapter 8. Chapter 8 is a little different response. But chapter 9, we've got the covenant and the rainbow. So again, God's response to the flood, it's a doublet there, two different things that almost look like two different stories. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so we've looked at 8 different, what I would call doublets, and I mean that as objectively as possible, that they simply are there more than once. I don't know that we can make hay out of that, but it can point to something. In the most sympathetic reading of the terms, you could say it just emphasizes, keeps us up to date. But you could also say it looked like maybe there's more than one community writing this story. And I'm just going to tell you that I believe this story is a couple of different accounts of the flood that have been stitched together by an editor at some point, which is why we're going to see some doublets throughout. But more than doublets, we're also going to see some tensions. Okay? So let me demonstrate this for you with this question. How many of each animal did Noah take on the ark? You know the answer to this. Say it out loud right now. Right, 2. That is right. If you read chapter 6, verses 19 through 20. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind onto the ark to keep them alive. You shall make. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kind, of the animals according to their kind, of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come to you to keep them alive. Then, in chapter 7, verses 15 and 16, they went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh in which there was the breath of life. Okay? So, 2 is the right answer. You said 2 and you were right. On the other hand, when you look at chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, God says to Noah, take with you 7 pairs, 14 of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. So 2 of unclean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air. So 14 of each kind of bird, they're male and female, to keep them alive on the face of the earth. So, you've got not only 2 by 2, which is how we sing the song and think the story, but elsewhere it says, actually 7 of these kinds of animals, 2 of those, and of the birds, 7 pairs, not 7 animals, but 7 pairs. So, you might have 14 of certain kinds of animals and 2 of others. That's not going to be how our pictures of Noah's Ark look when we paint them for our grandchildren, right? Okay, so you could also ask, so that's a tension. That's what I'm saying. It's not just a doublet, but it's a tension, which is why I think we might have 2 different hands at work in telling this story. So you also ask the question, what kind of animals did Noah take? And again, in chapter 7, verse 2, you've got the clean and the unclean. In chapter 7, verses 8 and 9, clean and unclean, male and female. In chapter 8, verse 20, Noah sacrificed clean animals and clean birds. Folks, up until this moment in the scriptures, there's nothing that has established some animals being clean while others are unclean. That happens later, much later, after Moses has ascribed the law. And in the law, now you've got a distinction between the clean and the unclean. You're supposed to eat these and not that. It has a lot to do with dietary habits of that day and so forth. But so far, first 6, 7, 8, 9 chapters of Genesis, there hasn't been an establishment between clean and unclean animals. And now suddenly you've got that language making its way into a story that apparently happened long before that distinction was actually made. I'm just giving that to you, that in some of the verses it's just animals, and perhaps described as creepy crawly, flying and wild, domestic, and in other parts of the story suddenly we've got a clean distinction between clean and unclean animals. That's not just a doublet, that's a tension. It's not the language that parts of the story use, but it is the language that other parts of the story use. Okay? You could also ask the question, how long did the flood last? And I'm telling you, if you like to add numbers and try to figure things out, have at it. I am looking at it, it is a hot mess. And to put your finger on exactly how long this whole ordeal was, one person I read said, worked hard to put all the numbers together and said, actually there are 2 different possibilities and they're about a month off from one another. Okay. What I want to do is just look at time signatures throughout the story. They enter the ark, and 7 days later the flood starts. That's what it says in one place. On another place it says the flood starts, and that's the day they entered the ark. So we might have 7 days there. The rain falls for 40 days. That seems rather consistent as a signature, time signature, 40 days. Another place it says that the rain subsides for 40 days. Another place it says the waters swell for 150 days. If you've ever been in a place that has flooding, the rivers that overflow the bank continue to rise after the rain itself has actually stopped. That's always a little bit shocking. But that's because of the waters in the river itself are coming in from all kinds of directions, and it takes a while for the swelling to reach its height. In one part of the story, the swelling lasts for another 150 days. In another part of the story, the swelling went down, the water abated. It had abated after 150 days. But in another part of the story, it's after 40 days that Noah sends out a raven and never sees it again. So he sends out a dove. Whether he did that immediately or the next day or weeks later, we don't know. The dove doesn't seem to find anything and comes back, so it has no place to land. So 1 week later, Noah sends out the dove again, and this time when it comes back, it brings an olive branch in its beak. So the waters have started to subside. And then another week later, Noah sends out the dove, and this time it doesn't return because it finds a nesting place. So you got a couple weeks to factor in there. The story says that the ark rested, settled on Mount Ararat in the 7th month on the 17th day. The 7th month of, we're not sure. Maybe after the flood started, or maybe not. Because there's also a time signature that says Noah is 600 when the flood starts. The first time you read it, it almost looks like it's his 600th birthday. But then it says the flood started during Noah's 600th year in the 2nd month on the 17th day. This is real precise time signature here. And you know, if we only knew when Noah had been born, we could plot it on a calendar. And then it says in Noah's 601st year, in the 1st month, the waters were dried up. And in the were drying up. And then in the 2nd month, on the 27th day, the earth was dry. So you've got all these time stamps. Some of them are relative to others. Some of them are relative to Noah's age. Some of them are just a little signature of time, a week, 2 weeks, whatever. Some of them might agree or disagree. And, add it all together. And the author that I read said you can come up with two conclusions that are about a month apart, arguing that the whole thing was just around a year. I don't know. I don't think it actually happened in real time, so I don't care that we can put real time on it. But again, there are so many hot mess details about the duration of the flood and being in the ark that you just can't be precise. Perhaps that's what I'm saying. There's one other tension in the story, and that is, I mentioned it earlier, where the waters come from. On the one hand, you have the rain that falls out of the sky, and on the other, in a couple places, it talks about the water coming up out of the earth itself. You remember in the second creation story, there hadn't been rain yet, but water would come out of the earth, and this parts of this story seem to be drawing on that tradition. I am running out of time, so let me say, on Wednesday we'll talk about this. I am going to try to walk you through the first creation story and some of the language of that story and where you see it in the flood story. And then the second creation, some of the language from that story and where we see that in the flood story. Because it is my argument that the community that wrote the first creation story and the community that wrote the second creation story both wrote flood stories that somebody has woven together into a single narrative. So there you have two voices in separate chapters. Here you've got two voices threaded together by an editor along the way. We'll discuss that with regard to God and animals on Wednesday. I have to stop, but boy, there's so much more we could look at, and I hope to see you on Wednesday so we can talk about it more. Thanks.